Well, thanks again for taking the time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So I guess the first question would be, I mean, in terms of the rules of what can and can't be posted in social media, what are they exactly, and what should people who wish to be influencers or who even users of social media be aware of before they hit the post button?
One thing you really need to be aware of is that the laws in relation to content in this part of the world apply equally to a publisher of a magazine or somebody who is making a broadcast television program or somebody who's posting on social media or online. So there is no difference under the law based on the technology you're using. Content is content, so you need to comply with the laws of the country.
So, for example, then filming people outside with, you may or may not get their permission to post it online. Mm-hmm. For example, if it's a television company, there's licenses and permits they get to film in certain places.
Absolutely, yes.
So that also applies to social media then?
Strictly under the law, yes. If you're shooting for a commercial purpose anywhere in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi, you should have a permit to do that. I think the law is in place. It's not always enforced the way that it should be. But if you're in a place and clearly filming, you can expect someone to come up and ask you what you're doing.
I see. You know, in other cases, for example, many of these influencers who have hundreds of thousands or millions of followers, even they'll post content that's paid for by it might be a hotel or a clothing brand, for example.
Yes.
What are the rules behind that? Do they have to mark clearly this is paid for content by?
Yeah, this is a really interesting part of the law, because quite clearly the regulations that the National Media Council have put out do state that you have to have a clear separation between editorial comment and advertising content. And we're not seeing that at the moment in the region. And if you look at the way the Federal Trade Commission is operating at the moment in the US, they're extremely clear that even if you're doing an Instagram post or a tweet that has been paid for by a brand, even if that payment is just a free night in a hotel or a nice meal, anything that's of value, you need to declare that, and that declaration has to be #ad. It can't be #thanks or anything that's vague, that doesn't clearly show that this is an advertising material and has been paid for. We're not seeing that in this region yet, even though the law states that we should. And what I'm anticipating is in 2018, we're going to see the government focusing on this a lot more, and I expect that we'll see some notices being given out to some of the major influencers.
And so as of now, there's been very little enforcement of what the law says.
We could possibly go to zero on that I'm aware of. I'm certainly not aware of any enforcement. And
I mean, when, presuming these regulations are enforced in 2018 or in the future, what do you think will happen then to the industry? Will a lot of people just vanish overnight?
It's interesting, because according to the influencers, if they do post with a #ad or something similar, the engagement with that post drops significantly. And if you have a look at some of the major influencers here, and if you see one of their very clearly paid for posts, you generally see about a 50% drop off, just from anecdotal evidence, and that's obviously significant for them because that represents less money in the bank. So I do think that it will affect influencers and the way they operate. And
in terms of contracts and contractual obligations between the influencer and the brand, how does that work exactly? I mean, how do both parties ensure that they're getting what they've agreed upon?
I think it's really important for the brand to have a contractual relationship with their influencers. It always surprises me when they don't, because if they're going to sponsor somebody under a normal old-fashioned sponsorship agreement, there would be pages and pages and pages about conduct and termination for bad behaviour, and you will turn up to 3 events a year, you will be on our billboard, you will be. But for some reason in social media, brands seem to be not doing this, even though it's still a form of a sponsorship relationship. You're attaching a person to your brand, and that person is outside of the control of your brand. They're not an employee. Why wouldn't you want a contractual relationship? I think it's really important. From the influencer as well, I think there must be some security in them knowing what is expected from them in the relationship. You know, it's 5 tweets a week, or it's 2 Facebook, or it's, you know, 7 photographs of Instagram every month, whatever it is, that so they know that they're going to get their money because they've complied with what was required of them.
And you mentioned that you think in many cases still that that's not happening.
Yes, it's not happening.
And that obviously results in one or both unhappy parties.
I generally find that if there's no contract, somebody ends up being disappointed because there's no clear pathway in the relationship. It's, you know, I find often when I'm negotiating a contract in this space, I will say to the brand, what is it that you want from this influencer? And when I say to them, no, well, how many tweets? And they'll say, we want 12. When I go back to the influencer, they look at it and they say, no, it was only ever about 3. So before we even they think they've got a deal, but when I actually get down to putting it on paper, it turns out that they actually have very different expectations of the relationship.
And when regulations do come in place, then those will be designed to protect both the brand and the influencer.
I think if the National Media Council goes ahead and starts to enforce the regulation in relation to the separation of editorial and advertising, that is actually for the protection of the consumer. The business-to-business relationship is not, they're not going to take an interest in that.
And the protection of the consumer, could you elaborate on that?
The whole reason why any regulator is keen to ensure that there's a separation between editorial and advertising is so that there's no confusion in the eye of the consumer about whether or not this is a genuinely held opinion of someone that they respect. So if Kim Kardashian, if she's your cup of tea, if she's holding a Pepsi and you like Kim Kardashian and you think she's holding it because she likes, that influences you towards buying a Pepsi. But if it's a paid relationship, then you can analyse it in a different way. She's paid to hold the Pepsi, therefore, perhaps I don't need to have a Pepsi in my life. It's that level of trust that you place in somebody. And when you tell a consumer, I'm paid to do this, they can make a better judgment as to whether or not they believe the content.
And do you think in this region that, I mean, given everything you've said, that line is a little blurred in terms of public perception? There
is absolutely no indication in 90% of the posts that I've seen that it is an ad. They often hashtag the brand name, so for me that's an indicator, but it's not necessarily paid for, and sometimes I don't see whether that line is clear.
And I mean, is this region unique in that regard, or is, I mean, just I suppose?
It's a good question. I haven't really benchmarked across the world. I know that the major territories, the US, the UK, Europe, are all looking at this, and the Federal Trade Commission in the US, I mean, they're at the point now where they're writing very serious warning letters to influencers, and the next step for them will be fines, and they're not messing around. You know, Naomi Campbell's on the list. There's people on that list who are significant celebrity names, and they're saying to them, the law applies to everybody, including you.
Interesting. And I mean, is when setting up the contracts between the influencer and the brand, how does one factor in the fact that many of the followers, which presumably the brand is paying for, many of them might not be real followers or might be paid for followers? I mean, is that something that, from a contractual standpoint, anything can be done about it?
One of the things that I always encourage brands to do when they're going into a contract with an influencer is to make sure that they get access to the data that sits within the account of the influencer. They won't have necessarily access to all of that data, and that data is things like that. How many of the bots, how many of them are, you know, repeat customers, where they've got agreements between the influencers to always post and like and comment on each other's, retweet each other's stuff to try and increase the value of each other as influencers. And I think, from what I understand, I'm not a technical person, but I do understand that a lot of that data can be accessed from the influencer themselves and should be provided contractually. That way you get to protect your brand, and you know that you're getting value from the money that you're spending, because it's significant amounts of money that's being spent now.
Yeah, of course, thousands of dollars.
It's thousands of dollars just for them to do a tweet and appear at a party. It's a lot of money.
And when all the regulations that you mentioned come into play, in terms of the economics of it, what does that mean will it mean that they make less, or that they're making?
It's quite possible they will make less. It is quite possible that they'll make less. I mean, we'll have to see how the consumers will react in this market. The US market has dropped, as far as I'm aware. The value of influencers has dropped in that market. That may be because there's just an awful lot of people who are being contracted, or it may be because they're declaring that it's #ad now. I couldn't comment on that, but we may see a depletion in the value of an influencer.
Kind of a public perception that it doesn't happen overnight. It
doesn't. I mean, it's taken. The Federal Trade Commission started sending their first batch of letters in May 2017. They sent the second batch in September 2017. We're still waiting to see if they're going to take that third step of issuing fines, and I don't expect we'll see that for another couple of months.
Well, that's actually all the questions I had. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you. Nothing at all. It's been a pleasure.
Perfect. Thank you.
Bye.